this session, we also thought it would be a very good idea to invite someone who presents a more individual perspective as a researcher on the topic of academic responsibility, social impact, and public engagement. So we found an excellent candidate in Dr. Koen Leurs from Utrecht University, former colleague of mine. And he has, his talk has the title Societal Impact, Public Engagement and Research Ethics in Challenging Times. For whom, with whom, and what for are we co-creating knowledge? That's really a mouthful, Koen. But you will explain it later to us. So Koen Leurs is an associate professor in gender, media, and migration studies at Utrecht University. His work focuses strongly on digital migration studies. He has been a PI in multiple international studies on asylum migration in the past and in the present. He is located at the Faculty of Humanities at Utrecht University in the Department of Gender, Media and Migration Studies. And we see with sad eyes that the developments in the area of gender studies are not very favorable in the United States. This area of research is currently contested, like vaccine studies and climate research. In his talk, he will focus on external pressures using the example of research on asylum migration, and he will challenge us to think along what ethical safeguards and what critical engagement seems warranted, and challenging the conventional research frameworks. So being a former co-member with him in the Ethics Committee of the Faculty of Humanities, it's even more with more pleasure that I want to announce you. So Koen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mariette. Thanks so much, Rita, for organizing and making us come together here in this space. And thanks so much also for allowing this room to give a little bit of a behind the scenes account of what it means to be a researcher in this contemporary moment, but also to work on challenging topics such as migration, but also particularly migration in relation to digital technologies, as I hope to talk through with you today. So indeed, I'm speaking from expertise and grounding in three fields of scholarship, and mostly critical fields of scholarship. So critical migration studies, critical media studies, and critical gender studies, which all bring questions of social justice, of human rights, to the agenda, and also to the foreground of what it means to produce knowledge. So to also see how we can produce knowledge to move towards those goals, to keep those goals in mind, and also just to prioritize some of the voices and knowledges which are commonly maybe sidelined, made invisible, or not as apparent. So what I'd like to do here is indeed to draw from a very specific case and to see how it can speak to some of the challenges, but also the larger paradox that we've heard repeatedly talked about in the previous talks. So I'll be speaking about the specific case in the Netherlands, which is happening at the very beginning of the asylum procedure, where people filing asylum are being asked to hand over their device, their smartphone, their laptops, their tablets, in order to be screened for the purpose of detecting potential instances of smuggling, people smuggling, for the sake of safeguarding national security, but also to establish people's identities. So these are the three aims of this process. And I will try to situate and relate this to the larger paradoxical moment. So we are seeing specific missions and vision statements of our universities, the larger push towards open science, but simultaneously how this is also becoming increasingly challenged, like a challenging operation to do both methodologically, but also to be and become visible, let's say, in the public arena. What does it mean, and how can we maybe find some guidelines on how to do that? What can we fall back onto when we engage in the public arena? So I want to situate this and relate this a bit more broadly in some of the more epistemological discussions within the critical fields of gender, migration, and media. Take cues from scholarship which seeks to also articulate different ways of doing ethics and thinking about ethics in these challenging terrains, and also then how we can maybe think towards rules of public engagement. So how can we strengthen ourselves when we enter the public arena, trying to defend specific knowledges that might not favor contemporary political landscapes, for example. So this is the case. When we read in the news how Netherlands organizations had been downloading gigabytes of data from asylum seekers' phones for the purpose of detecting instances of terrorism, while simultaneously this was also embraced as an opportunity by a specific big data unit of the police to develop a self-learning, a machine learning system, an AI, which could do the job of detecting human smuggling, detecting terrorists, and identifying people. We, and me being a consortium of researchers at Utrecht and beyond, were curious. What went down here? Because we also read in the news that this system, called the Athene pilot, had been shut down. So we read about a system being shut down, and we read about how gigabytes of data of asylum seekers were processed without seemingly any results. So we wondered, okay, what is going on? And what is current practice if this system has been abandoned? So this case does not stand, we realized and found over the time of our study, does not stand on its own. So we see across many countries in Europe, but also many countries across the world, particularly in the global north, that tech innovations are embraced to identify people on the move. And not only people forcibly on the move, not only asylum migration, we see a certain function creep, how these experiments tested on forced migration, on forced migrants, is creeping into other forms of mobilities. We already heard before how in the context of traveling to the US, us scholars are now being advised not to take our personal laptops, not to take our personal devices with us, because exactly we could be faced with the device that we see here on the right, which is a device by Celebrite, which can scrape the full forensic data of our phones, and it can break passwords and locks on different on videos, on apps, on your networks, in order to search for specific patterns in your phone. So this has already now become the situation at the US border. When anyone crossing and arriving on US soil, a border officer can decide that your phone can be fully scraped. So this is the situation now for many people, but in the context of Europe, in the context of Netherlands, this is the case for asylum seekers, still at the beginning of their asylum procedure. And this experiment began really, or gained political momentum after the so-called European refugee crisis of 2015-2016, coupled with the Paris bombings, which really raised large fears about that there could be potential terrorists among people fleeing wars, civil wars, for example, in Syria. Back then, the momentum was created where the police was given many more possibilities. Here, we have our Prime Minister Rutte stating the police will also have the option to read data carriers, such as telephones, if this would be deemed necessary. So this created the kind of precedent. So this is, in a snapshot, the multidisciplinary team, which includes Albert Salah, professor in data science, Jamila Schans, working outside of university with the Netherlands Data Center, WODC, Rianne Dekker, background in organizational studies, as well as Kinan Alayak, researcher within the fields of media culture. So we received some funding through the Universities of Netherlands and Comet, which seeks to investigate implications of the digitalization of society. So what we aim to do is investigate the matter, where the first challenge emerged. Because how do you study a hugely securitized setting where also huge commercial interests are at play? So here we learned from investigative journalists and actually from many migration and tech scholars worldwide that freedom of information requests can be repurposed also as a research methodology. So we did the same. We filed freedom of information requests to the Netherlands police, to immigration services, in order to find out and get more information. Well, the documents we received were not as useful. We were introduced to main actors behind this experiment. So the people who were involved in building the system and training the system and, for example, giving indicators to make the machine learning system. But also we experienced this situation of having to work with non-disclosure agreements. So some of the organizations wanted to collaborate, but there were rules at play. So they wanted to read, for example, transcripts of our interviews and wanted the right to fact-check findings. Things that I think that we could further discuss also during the Q&A. So what does it mean when we have to operate under these circumstances? But also particularly, what does it mean when we want to produce knowledge about these concerns? So we found, for example, when you hand over your device, you're asked to sign a form where you also state the access code to your phone to the police officer where you're handing it over. So these are kind of instances of information that we found, but also our main findings are that actually it is very much on purpose that people who are filing for asylum are not informed about their rights, about the procedure, and about what happens to the data that is collected from them in this procedure. So for us, finding this void of information was a key thorny question. Can we make this information public? Can we inform people who are going through this procedure about their rights, about the procedure, about what happens to their data? So after we published, we garnered some press attention, which also raised a second challenge. So what does it mean for us to operate in the public arena? And how can we find the tools to really find ways to do so? For example, we got into many heated encounters with spokespersons that stated they they didn't recognize themselves in our findings. So what does it mean when they couldn't find themselves in our findings, which for me in the sense of research integrity meant that they were challenging our rigorous scientific method. But it also meant, for example, that we were questioned on our sources. So they wanted to know who we spoke with the different organizations, etc. How do we relate to these challenges and how can we find ways to navigate them? And also in the spirit of public engagement, we started to ask ourselves, for whom are we producing this knowledge? With whom should we work and what for? So in the end, we decided to collaborate with the Refugee Council, indeed to make information videos together with previous asylum seekers, with lawyers, to touch and speak back to this void of information that exists. So basically to inform people filing for asylum about their rights, what happens to their devices, which then turned into a situation where some of the organizations did not want to collaborate anymore. And they started to more strongly push back. How do we operate in this arena? So for us, maybe to contextualize this a bit more broadly, so we found supported in doing this work and taking a stance and deciding who to collaborate with and who not, and whose interest to prioritize and who's not, in the value-laden mission statement of our university, which emphasizes this possibility for knowledge to be produced toward contributing to society, which implicitly, for example, also touched on questions of human rights, informing which we understood as a kind of means to indeed substantiate our decision to fill this gap of information void. However, the larger situation, which is also supported in open science agendas, which push, for example, for questions of inclusion, of attention for a multiplicity of voices, of equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. However, these commitments are increasingly also at odds within our very scholarly endeavor. So when we speak about how research and academic knowledge production should be disconnected from politics, should be disconnected from political incentives, this is also a challenge that we face. If particularly in the context of migration and digitization, for example, when we see that, for example, open science is a commitment of Horizon Europe, while simultaneously we see that Horizon Europe has a strong agenda which seeks to securitize Europe. So to search for digital disruptions, to increase security, increase surveillance, in which all of these initiatives, huge sums are invested, which all will lead to a further dehumanization of particular groups of people. In this sense, it will further infringe on the rights of asylum seekers, who are often seen as exceptions, for example, to EU law. Also in the EU AI Act, asylum migration is exempted from guidelines. So what does this mean? For us, this raises lots of questions about normalization. What do we take for granted? How come we've come to accept that Europe and the Mediterranean, with the Mediterranean, that Europe is still the deadliest migration destiny in the world? It's because of this common normalization and acceptance where Europe stands for something and that Europe should be defended and should be securitized. But how come the situation has emerged? How come that also we as producers of knowledge have a role to play here, and what role should we play here? I don't know how I'm doing for time. A few minutes. Okay, let me then maybe end with one note on epistemology, which really for us also was a reminder that all of the knowledge that we produce is situated, is coming from somewhere. So this is also amplifying Donna Haraway's work, who this year in November will be gifted the Erasmus Prize for her work. Donna Haraway is a feminist theorist of science, for exactly giving us tools to think about accountability in knowledge production. And for us, this was an important reminder to think about what is it, the knowledge that we are producing, how can we situate it, but also how we can become accountable for the knowledge that we produce, and indeed to be located. So our knowledge is coming from somewhere. It speaks to migration regimes in this instance, in the context of Europe, in the context of Netherlands. And I'll skip some slides just to come to the more practice. So if we choose to pursue research which is normative, which takes a stance, which seeks to become, make knowledge accountable and situated and address, for example, the human rights violations of asylum seekers, this means that we also have to think about ethics. So common frameworks built on this idea of do no harm, whereas in fields such as critical migration studies, there are scholars who are calling for and polemically calling for maybe frameworks that should do harm, for example, to institutions that normalize human rights violations, that make us take for granted these conditions. Or feminist ethics of care frameworks, which is a framework used in the book on the right, that seeks to address the specific situations of how we can care for vulnerabilized groups, for groups that are made invisible, for groups that are living beyond the radar, and very often purposefully so, how they are living lives below the radar. So just as a way of maybe ending, that I think, and I'm looking forward to hearing whether other researchers, so this is really a behind the scenes account of us trying to process some of the challenges that we were facing. So we were starting to seek and look out for how can we find ways of making do with the situation. And for us, this is a feeling of having a clear need of rules of engagement. So if we want to do, and if we're tasked to produce impact to the university, what kind of impact is the university looking for? Which means that this impact endeavor always becomes politicized. Which then would mean that also if we become accountable indeed for this situation, that we should think about what can then be the rules of engagement. If we want to pursue, and increasingly we as researchers in the arena are asked to produce publicly engaged knowledge, how can we do so? There are some guidelines on the screen by Albert Meyer, Mirko Scheef, and Floris Becks in a chapter which is coming out next year, which particularly maybe will offer some practical guidelines to think about, okay, when you're drawing up a project and thinking about co-design, co-creation, doing impact, it also means having difficult discussions with actors and deciding which actors, for example, to work with, to collaborate with, and also which actors to refuse, but also on which grounds. So making these kinds of conversations also explicit as part of research endeavors. And I think with that, I would like to draw to a close, but really also maybe to return our attention that the paradox, which we heard about this morning in several of the talks, won't go away soon. Rather, I think it will be exacerbating. And we should also come to terms with the situation where research and activism are not binary opposites, because we have gained lots of attention for different types of knowledge productions through the social movements over the last decades, really, which made us also attentive within the university to different forms of knowledge production and to how attend to different voices, which are very often sidelined. And then finally, more practically, can we think about rules of engagement, of doing this work, of appearing in the public arena? Thanks so much. That's what I wanted to say.